Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual. My guest today is the former US Ambassador to South Africa, Patrick Gaspard. He has been a leader and strategist in the Democratic Party and served as Executive Director of the Democratic National Committee. Appointed by President Obama as Ambassador to South Africa 2013 to 2016. He then became president of the George Soros Foundations, the Open Society Foundations, for the next 3 years. And since then, he has been president of the Center for American Progress, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Patrick, welcome back to South Africa, albeit virtually. It's a real privilege to spend some time with you this afternoon.
Thank you so very much, Ann. It's always an honor to be able to engage in conversation with you and your community at CDE. I've very much been looking forward to this Zoom. I wish that I were physically in South Africa. I miss it terribly.
Well, this is the next best thing. So let's start with your personal story. I understand that your parents came from Haiti and decided to go to the Congo for a few years, and that was where you were born. So tell us a little bit about that before we move on to the Democratic Party.
Sure. That is all the absolute fact. I've had quite a journey. My parents are from Haiti. My father was a young, newly trained lawyer in Haiti at the time that the Duvalier regime, the Papadoc regime came into power. There was a brutal oppression of anyone who dared call for free and fair elections in the country. My father had the disadvantage of being one of those people, and he was told in no uncertain terms that you have to stop your agitating for democracy or you'll be disappeared. He knew this was not an idle threat. It coincided with the time of great post-colonial liberation on the continent, and there was an opportunity to go to Africa as an educator that coincided with the pressure that he and hundreds of Haitian intellectuals in that period were feeling from the regime. And he and them went off into exile, into the Congo, where he was an educator and lived through the 60s. My mother eventually joined him, and I happened. Our family, which is a large family, eventually migrated to the US, to New York, where I was raised. And I'm somebody who's proudly American, but also proudly Haitian American, and always boastful of my Congolese origins.
Well, good that we have this connection through Africa. I know you've been involved in city, state, and national politics through the Democratic Party. Tell us a little bit about that and then your relationship with President Obama.
Yes. So my story of diaspora, my story of diaspora activism, my story of solidarity work, coalition work started very, very young, because my father would always drag me off to one demonstration after another at the United Nations, at the White House, in order to make sure that we were creating some kind of accountability and popular narrative around our struggles and the relationship between U.S. power in the world, the relationships that the U.S. had with the Congo, with Haiti, and all the places that we held dear, and how that power could be leveraged differently for human rights, for empowerment of civil society, and for the ability to have a more broadly shared prosperity around the world. That early training from in movement work eventually led to my being involved in work for workers, advocacy for workers in America through unions. There's an extraordinary organization called the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. I came into allianceship with it when I was a teenager, and got swept up in the latter stages of the anti-apartheid movement and joining luminaries like John Lewis and Harry Belafonte and many others who were getting arrested in front of the South African embassy. I received my PhD in activism from that extraordinary greatest generation ever, and eventually became a unionist myself. And in that space, as a consequence of that work, I understood that in America, electoral politics was the path to policy change, and I learned all that I could about local politics. I eventually ended up helping to elect, as a very young person, the first African-American mayor of New York, and that was David Dinkins. I worked in the Dinkins administration and then made my way up slowly but surely into the federal system, and had the occasion one year in 2003, as I was working with many other union leaders to try to determine what the path should be in the national election. I met a young, bright state senator, local elected official from Chicago, Illinois, who had an interesting name. And after engaging with him in a short period of time, I realized that Barack Obama had this powerful way of taking very complicated issues, boiling them down to their essence, and giving expression to them in a way that I thought spoke to America's aspirational DNA. And I knew right away this would be somebody who would eventually be a historic figure. I remember telling my wife shortly after meeting him that I had just met the person who would be the first Black president of the United States, and that when he decided to run, I'd be working with him. And I remember her saying, Baramba who? and, and of course, the rest is history. I got to serve on his national campaign as the political director. I eventually became the White House political director, and then the leader of the Democratic National Committee. And eventually, after we re-elected the president, he understood that I always wanted to be in service of my country, to the country of South Africa that I had first visited 30 years prior, and that where I cut my teeth in organizing. And it was the privilege of a lifetime, the honor of a lifetime, to be appointed U.S. ambassador. So that's in a nutshell, Anne.
Well, that's in a nutshell. I know there are a number of your friends who are listening online because you did have a big impact in South Africa. And now I understand you're head of a leading American think tank in Washington, the Center for American Progress. This is quite a relatively new organization when you think of the doyens of think tanks in Washington. So when and why was it established? And how has it helped the Biden administration craft and implement policy? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, before answering the question, Anne, I'm going to acknowledge your recognition that I have some South African friends who are on the line here. I want to recognize them and thank them for their role in my education. I arrived in South Africa with a tremendous amount of humility, with much to learn, and they filled my head with history and with a sense of a spark of innovation for the future. So I'm always going to be grateful to my friends in South Africa. And the Center for American Progress, which I affectionately call CAP, was launched 20 years ago. Last year, actually, was the 20th anniversary of CAP. It was created by a group of policy innovators who had a talent for public communication, who understood the relationship between movements and institutions of government and democracy. There's a gentleman by the name of John Podesta, who served several presidents. He worked with President Bill Clinton. He worked with President Barack Obama. When he launched CAP, Republicans were in power at that time in the Capitol and in the White House, and he and many others felt that there was a need to bring the best thinking under one tent, the best progressive thinking, the best notions of what it would mean to create an inclusive society that would run the gamut across education, the economy, healthcare, national security issues, to just kind of bring it all in one space where we could take advantage of how we use the tools of deep and rigorous research, a muscular kind of advocacy with conviction on the things that we believe in, and the ability to have a nimble, communications arm that could take up the tool of storytelling, which is really essential in any political movements. So they launched the effort with a considerably smaller staff and much smaller budget than we have today, and proved to be quite effective early on. First, in the work that they did at the national security space post 9/11, in insisting that Americans withdraw from the conflicts launched in the Middle East, and laid out a pathway for that withdrawal, and also in insisting that real investment needed to be made in healthcare in America. And a plan was devised in a small conference room at CAP that eventually became what's now affectionately known by us as Obamacare. So it's been effective from its initial launch right up till today. We are proud of the modest role we were able to play in centering workers in so many of the policies that have been essential to the core of the Biden post-pandemic economic recovery, the lifting up of a new industrial policy in this country, and one that takes into account the role of non-traditional workers in that industrial space, and ties it meaningfully to aspects of what we call the care economy. So it's been just a great journey for the organization, and it is really a blast to be able to lead it in this generation.
Well, interesting trajectory. Is there any particular policy your think tank has? I know you shouldn't take credit for things, but would like to take credit for in the Biden administration, something that you've crafted that's been implemented, and has it worked out as you planned?
Yeah, I would say that, and again, I'm really careful about what it means to claim credit, but we are clear about our influence. For many years, policy leaders and advocates in CAP worked feverishly in the space of climate change, in environmental justice, and made a set of recommendations of what it would look like for the government to make unprecedented investments in the climate space that would incentivize the private sector to match or outstrip those investments, but would do it in a way that would not only reduce emissions, but also create protections for communities that have been long made vulnerable in our car-centric economy, in our emissions economy. And those recommendations found their way into what's now known as the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. And I think they have been critical already to helping the United States meet its emissions goals, and to helping spark a real revolution in renewables and clean energy, but also in reducing emissions from automobiles and incentivizing battery production, chip production, that will allow America to increase its competitiveness into the second half of the 21st century. So we're really, really proud of that work. We think it had, to answer your question about whether or not it's worked, it's absolutely worked, both for economic recovery and for our journey on climate. The real challenge, Anne, has been in narrative, in storytelling, how we communicate on all of this in ways that accrues to the political benefits of legislators who've had to take some tough, some difficult votes. I think the jury is still out on the narrative aspect of that, but we're all working on it. But I have no doubt about the policy success, and we're already starting to see the intended impact on people who live in cities like Kalamazoo in Michigan, where we've seen a turnaround, and what this has meant for small business owners, for what it's meant to African-American communities that have been isolated from the centers of the economy because of the kind of highway construction that divided those communities, and resources have gone in to open those spaces up and revitalize those economic thoroughfares. And that really, the policy actually matters, Anne.
Yay. I'm pleased to hear that. You were once asked in an interview what Americans get wrong about South Africa and Africa more generally, and your wonderful answer was everything. Could you tell us a bit about how you see this?
I always get nervous when I hear myself being quoted back to myself. I'm always thinking, what did I say? What did I mean? Look, um, I would still give that same response, but that can often be true on both sides of the Atlantic. There are so many misperceptions in the U.S. About the continent writ large, about South Africa and its journey. Unfortunately, in the mass media here in the U.S., most African nations only make their way onto our news, onto the pages of the New York Times, or onto our screens in CNN when there's a crisis, when something's gone wrong somewhere in the world. And most often it kind of burnishes an image, an impression of Africa and South Africa as a space that's always on the receiving end of aid, and not a space of innovation, not a space of renaissance, not a space where you have a burgeoning generation of young people who are optimistic, who are entrepreneurial, who understand that the future belongs to them, but only if they're able to make sure that their economic journey is accompanied by democratic reform at the same time. I guess it was 2 months ago now, I was in Nigeria. And Nigeria is one of the most fascinating places on earth. Most Americans are unaware of the explosive growth of the Nigerian diaspora in the United States, in states like Texas, and Georgia, North Carolina, and elsewhere. They encounter Nigerian energy sometimes in our pop culture, and don't appreciate that it is illustrative of a broader entrepreneurial streak that I think is going to make a difference in transforming American communities in positive ways as well. As it relates to South Africa, sometimes it feels as if my American friends just see South Africa as a place that's frozen in time. They're aware of apartheid, they're aware of Nelson Mandela, and there's very, very, very little knowledge of what's happened in the post-apartheid decades. Sometimes South Africa will surface in our news because of an offensive remark made by somebody like, oh, I don't know, Donald Trump. And that'll be the extent of it. Americans little understand that we have tens of thousands of automobiles that are riding in the streets of the US that were manufactured in South Africa. They don't understand the agricultural trade relationship that we have with South Africans. Most Americans are woefully unaware of the impact that the South Africa banking industry has all up and down the African continent, and how strong, vital, and essential that industry is. And they don't have any means of knowing that investments that their government, that the US has made in helping to stand up healthcare infrastructure in South Africa has really been transformational, not just throughout South Africa, but has benefited us in the US. When you see the kinds of epidemiologists that have emerged from South Africa that are making their mark throughout the world. So I just think that there's a kind of, the other thing that I would add, Ann, is I think that we're in a time in America now where many of us are casting about, looking for things that we can do to reform our own institutions of democracy in America. And we don't appreciate that there is powerful scaffolding around the values that we hold dear in places like the South African Constitution, which is one of the most advanced, sophisticated, progressive constitutions that exists anywhere in the world. I once was in a dinner with rest in peace, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, former Supreme Court Justice. And we had a wonderful conversation about South Africa. And she said to me what she had said publicly that if she could remake America's Constitution overnight, she would start with South Africa's as her framework, because she thought it was the one constitution in the world that centered the public good and basic and tied meaningfully human rights to basic access to things like housing and healthcare. So there's so much that's not understood about South Africa, so much that's not understood about the African continent, but folks are coming around, slowly but surely.
Well, don't take our PR system, but let's not go there. Turn this around. I think most South Africans don't understand America very well. Would you agree with that? All its many achievements as well as its challenges. How do you see that? What was your experience?
I think that's right. I think that there is a kind of Disneyfication of the perception of the United States in many places abroad, but definitely in South Africa. I would quickly say, Anne, that I think that you and many South Africans understand us better than we understand you, but there are still absolutely gaps in knowledge. One of the things that I found interesting when I was in South Africa is I would go and often have conversations with university students. I'd be invited to a campus at Wits or in the Cape, and I'd have these great conversations with the smartest young people I ever met. But they would make these comparisons all the time between African states and the U.S. that I thought were a little distorted. They thought there was a way that we had kind of perfected this notion of the American dream and the upward climb of the ladder into the middle class, which they seem to see as this kind of inevitable thing for everybody in the opportunity economy that we had in the U.S. I think there was a little understanding of some of the challenges that we have with maladministration. I think that South Africans and many on the continent are not able to see the illiberal threats, the threats of corruption that we have that are active in our politics and that were basically a feature of our politics up until about 60 years ago as a consistent thing across the states. I'm proud to be an African American. I beat my chest all the time about the values that we hold dear here, but there's a way that opportunity in America is uneven, and I think that there are institutional barriers that are not entirely understood in Africa. I think that when I was in South Africa, I'd always say that the U.S. is the shining beacon of hope on economically and democratically. I would still say that, but I think that the fragility of our systems, the fragility of our overall culture has been made bare in the last several years post January 6th in ways that probably would have been impossible for many of my friends in South Africa to appreciate when I was living there at the time.
Well, let me turn then to the US elections.
Must we, Anne? Must we? I thought you and I were having fun, a good old time here.
I'm afraid so.
You want to talk about hard things, Anne?
Well, I'm warming you up. Now I want to get to the heart of things. I'm not going to ask you to predict, but I want to talk about the elections. Let me start with something you once said, that the US president will be chosen not by the American people, but by an archaic election system, cobbled together in the 18th century that is both undemocratic and deeply vulnerable to corruption. Tell us why you made such a sweeping charge about the US system.
That sounds a little prescient, given what's happened in the years since I said that. I think it's interesting. You said at the top just now that you won't ask me to make any predictions. I'm proud that I have removed myself from the business of prognostication since 2016. I was in South Africa in 2016 and had several hundred good South African friends in my residence as we were awaiting the results of the U.S. Election in the wee hours, South Africa wee hours, and there was a palpable gasp in that room as the truth came into clarity about what the results likely would look like. And it was interesting then, Anne, to really have it hit home in a concrete way for me that so many people around the world feel this deep connection to America, and they understand that the direction of travel of American democracy has some meaningful impact for their expectations in their own home countries. And I felt that night in South Africa. So I think I was obviously right to call the Electoral College an archaic system. I think it's an anti-democratic system. There have been, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think I'm right. There have been 5 times in US history where the winner of the popular vote for president did not also win the Electoral College. I think that's deeply undemocratic. The Electoral College was a compromise crafted in 1787 during the Constitutional Convention in America, where there was a tremendous amount of tension between the northern states and the southern states about how population would be allocated and whether or not there would be a system of direct one person, one vote for the chief executive of the United States, or if there would be a different kind of representative republic. And the Electoral College was the compromise. It's important for South Africans to understand that at the moment that that architecture was put together, fully 1/3 of the population of those southern states were Black people who were not free. They were slaves, and they were not counted as individual citizens. I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of the 3/5 compromise in the US and the way those shackled Black people were counted in our politics. And that spilled over into the construction of the Electoral College compromise, which allowed states like Virginia, that at the time of 1787, fully 60% of all the population of Virginia were slaves. And there's a way that those slaves were counted in a fashion, even though they could not vote and participate in the democracy at all, in a way that boosted the electoral power of slaves, of states like Virginia, which is why for the first 36 years of America's life as a quote, quote, democracy, 32 years of those were dominated by a president that came from Virginia. It's an astounding thing to see, but that was because of the Electoral College's boon for those states. That's carried over into modern democracy where in America, where right now a voter from Wyoming counts 4 times as much in our system as an individual voter in a state like California. That's true in how our US Senate seats are apportioned to such a dangerous degree, Anne, that in 20 years or thereabouts, 70% of the US population will be represented by only 30% of the US senators if things may continue on this trajectory. Right now, today, because of the Electoral College, candidates don't have to campaign in the entire country. They just have to campaign in the states that are the tipping point states that enable them to get to 270 electoral votes. Currently, there are 7 of those states that are, quote, in play, where the margins are really close, and we're not clear whether or not they're going to move towards Republicans or Democrats. We all know that states like California and New York are going to vote for Kamala Harris overwhelmingly. We also know that states like Arizona, states like Ohio are going to swing for Donald Trump. So neither candidate has to spend that much time or any resources in those states. All of the resources are disproportionately going into 7 states. Those 7 are 3 of what we would call the industrial states, also known as blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And then there are 4 states that are called Sun Belt states, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina. the entire US election will be decided in those states and are overwhelmingly going to be decided by about 10% of the population that right now either has not yet made up their mind or can be persuaded to swing to another candidate. I think that until the US moves to a direct election of the president, one person, one vote, as opposed to the electoral college, that we're going to find ourselves in these difficulties and this disproportionality of how representation works in America.
Thanks for that very clear exposition. Two questions. My first one is, do you see any, let me put it this way. At one level, one person, one vote, which counts for equal value, seems self-evident that that's the right way to go for any country. But there are also some learned people, scholars of constitutional systems and Democrats, who say that you need some geographic weighting and that majority takes all systems have problems of their own. Do you see any advantages, or is there any argument for a reformed electoral college, but some kind of geographic or other kind of weighting? How do you see that issue?
No, I think that's a fantastic question, and I think that's a question that's actually deserving of a congressional commission, a presidential panel, a transparent and accountable public conversation that takes place over time to say, is this the right system? Does this work well? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? There are many reforms that I'd love to see in our system. I think that our process of electing candidates through partisan primaries is one that requires examination in the US. We have two major parties, and if you're not hailing from one of those major parties, you have a difficult time getting the resources that you need and the public political attention that you need to capture imaginations and hearts and minds. I think that we have an extraordinary problem that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world of outsized influence of big money in our politics in America. The sums that we expend for local contests in America dwarf the resources that are used for national political campaigns everywhere else in the world. Like the numbers are absolutely astonishing. So when you look at money in politics, when you look at the growing polarization that exists in our country that is exacerbated by our first past the post primary system, and when you look at a system where 43 of the 50 states are deemed in a way inconsequential to the ultimate outcome based on where all the resources have to be invested, it suggests that there are major cracks in the wall of democracy in America that bear analysis and I think reform. January 6th of 2021 is an incident that's not possible if not for the electoral college system. It's just that it just would not have played out in that way. I think that your question is really good. I am not going to pretend to be an expert in electoral systems all around the world, but I think there are things that I've seen in many places, South Africa included, that bear examination and could lead to real innovation in the US. One thing I do know, Ann, is the Electoral College, as it's currently constructed, needs revision, needs reform. We are no longer in 1787. Many of the assumptions that were made by the framers of that compromise, many of those assumptions have been proven to be incorrect and were quickly proven to be incorrect. And yet we still have not reformed the system to respond to those challenges. And it's long past time to do that.
The whole issue of money in politics is such a difficult one and fraught. whether it's India, South Africa, Brazil, or America. But I do always want to remind myself and others that, Michael Bloomberg put an extraordinary amount of money into his campaign to be a presidential candidate and was singularly unsuccessful. So there is some balance in this. There are dangers, enormous dangers, but there are also some correctives, I think.
Though I'd remind
How
you,
do you think?
I'd remind you that Michael Bloomberg becomes a national figure because he put ungodly sums of money into being elected mayor of New York multiple times and completely dwarfed the competition and democratic discourse on the airwaves in my hugely important city. And that had some real consequences. But your larger point about his personal resources in that contest not being sufficient to get him anywhere close to the finish line is one that's well taken. I will note that in this moment, though, we are seeing on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, we're seeing a select number of extraordinarily wealthy Americans who are playing outsized roles in our politics. I think it's extraordinary that Elon Musk can use his social media platform in a way that clearly is a partisan political contribution, but it's not counted as such in our campaign finance system. And then he can just announce that he's going to move $75 million. It's over $100 million now into a political action committee to elect a candidate while he's clearly in coordination with that candidate and their campaign. There are things about our system that are broken and need real examination and absolute reformation.
Mm. Point taken. I always think electoral reform is so hard because it's like asking the turkeys to vote for Christmas, but hopefully we can get there. But let me come to some other important questions. What do you think happens in America if Donald Trump wins?
It's a good question. We have some proof points from the past because it happened once before. And we experienced a presidency that started in its first days with a declaration, a prejudiced, just radical declaration of a ban against Muslims coming into America that led to instant mobilization, litigation that this administration, that his administration eventually lost. But it started on that footing. And ended, of course, infamously with a autocratic grasp for anti-democratic power, which the whole world saw on January 6th. Those were the bookends of that administration. In the middle of that, the only thing that Donald Trump could count as a legislative success was a tax program that he passed with Republican leadership on Capitol Hill that accrued entirely to the benefit of the richest 1% of Americans that rolled back their taxes, that significantly rolled back public taxes, corporate taxes, and that but really mushroomed the deficit. The national deficit to an extent that had not been seen before. So we had prejudice on the front end, anti-democratic chaos on the back end as he was forced to exit, and in the middle, a policy that did not benefit at all the working class Americans that he purported to be a champion of, but that were instead completely skewered towards his wealthiest friends. Did nothing to contend with the profound challenge of affordability in housing in America. Did not take on the fentanyl and opiate crisis that he talked about in the campaign, but didn't address whatsoever as president, and had a series of national security advisors, attorney generals, chiefs of staff, who all, one after another, had to really publicly rebuke him for overreach in the executive office in ways that were not in keeping with our norms and our standards, that were anti-constitutional. Many fell on the sword, lost their jobs, were removed by trying to create some measure of checks and balances on a president who had completely run away with his personal discipline and any notion of the limits of executive authority in the United States. Oh, and by the way, we also saw chaotic governance and management over a global pandemic that led, by some estimates, to hundreds of thousands more deaths in the United States than should have occurred if he had simply followed the science and the guidance from his own senior advisors and healthcare agencies. So all that happened on his watch. Now, fast forward, Ann, we're in a moment where it's abundantly clear, based on his own rhetoric, that Donald Trump not only intends to not surround himself with senior members of the Republican Party who would be seen as attempting to put some stops, some brakes, and some guardrails around his worst abuses. He has actually said that he would weaponize the Department of Justice, the FBI, the National Guard, to go after people who he has deemed, quote, enemies of the state. And by that, he means his own personal political enemies. He's threatened the press with this abuse of authority as well, in addition to others in the Democratic Party. There is a 922-page manifesto for the seizure of power in the United States that your audience may have heard of. It is called Project 2025. Something in the order of 70% of the authors of this authoritarian playbook work directly with Donald Trump or have had some association with his administration and or his campaigns. And in it, they are clear that if they have another opportunity to be in power, they are going to blow up the federal civil administration of our workforce. There are 50,000 federal employees that are not political appointees that Donald Trump and his circle would like to have exit out of the government so they can replace them by political hacks who will do the bidding of this president in agencies that are intended to be independent of executive authority and independent of partisan politics. We have seen Donald Trump time and again, when he was in office, politicize disaster relief, and his own chief of staff had to make it clear to him that those resources had to go equally in states, cities that had either voted for him or against him. And now he makes claims today, while he campaigns, that he will treat the red states and those who voted for him differently than he would treat those who come from other cities and states. I could go on and about the near and present danger that this person represents for our democratic institutions and for basic rights in this country. But I think that his vulgarity, his inability to express any empathy at all for the most vulnerable people in our country speaks volumes about how he would govern if given a second term.
So let me ask you this. The election is very close. We all know that. What's wrong with the voters? What's going on in America that so many people want to vote for somebody with the track record you're describing? That's my first question. And the second is, what happened to the Republican Party? The party that was committed to democracy, to a whole lot of things that have just been jettisoned. How do you see that?
All the things that used to be nonpartisan, right? It's interesting.
Yeah.
Somebody who And I've been involved in global human rights practice for so long, and that used to be a bipartisan instinct in America, and now it most certainly is not that. Before I answer your question about what's going on in the electorate, I should note that my response to you about what a second Trump administration looks like was entirely focused on the domestic. We should be really clear that this is somebody who
to international
okay,
if we
all
time.
right.
Yeah,
So,
great.
so then
The
we'll get.
minor issues, a few wars and other
Yes,
things.
you're so good about this, Ann. Look, I would say this: it's not just in the U.S. We have seen this kind of turn towards an attraction to autocrats all around the world, in global North, global South. We've seen it in many countries that you and I can tick off with multiple examples across the length and breadth of the globe. So there is something about the moment that we're living in. I think that it is a confluence of multiple global crises like the Great Recession and the pandemic that have created a downward pressure on public assets, the lived experience of average folks who are seeing themselves buried by the cost of living, by runaway inflation. All those things are real. So I think it's that coupled with the tension that we're seeing again across the board, global North, global South, that comes from the greatest movement of humans across the planet in one time that we've ever experienced. We've seen that over the course of the last 10 to 20 years across the globe with a kind of hyper migration that's led to a hyper sovereignty, right? The sense of politics of sovereignty around the world, where folks seem to feel that they need to build moats around their countries and pull up the drawbridge, not appreciating that the challenges that we have are transnational in nature and require transnational cooperation. There is greater and greater cynicism and skepticism about democracy itself when people don't seem to, they look around and they don't see the democracy dividend. They don't see how it's paying off in lives where they just feel a kind of spiritual malaise. There's a stagnancy. They don't believe that the economy will be better for their children than it was for them. All of that leads to a cynicism and a skepticism. And when people say we need more democracy, they think whether it's in Hungary or India or in the United States or in South Africa, with your born free generation, they say, how has this exactly benefited for me? We need a different direction. So there's that, and the reality of several global cataclysms happening in a short period of time, the challenge of the psychology of changing demographics in countries, and then all of that has happened in the midst of a revolution in how we communicate with one another and amongst ourselves, a changed communication ecosystem. That's the greatest revolution in human communication that certainly you and I have ever experienced in our lifetime, but the greatest one that's been experienced since the invention of the printing press, right? So how we live now through our screens, through our phones in ways that are governed overwhelmingly by algorithms that take us all into our own house of mirrors, which are houses of horror, I think speaks really a great deal as to why we're in this world that we're in, not just in the United States, but globally. I'll also add, Ann, as somebody who has worked, organized inside of the Democratic Party. As I said, I was the executive director of the Democratic National Committee for a period of time. I've worked on campaigns at every level on behalf of Democrats. I'll also say that there's a way that, at least in the United States, both political parties have been seen to be agents of the wealthiest people in the country, the most powerful people in the country, are not seen to be taking up a set of policies that are about working people, struggling people. So being able to kind of break through there in narrative and in clarity on policy making that makes it clear who we are fighting for, I think is hugely important, not just as a point of diagnosis of the challenge, but how we get out of that space that we're in. And as far as the Republican Party is concerned, they've been captured by the Frankenstein monster that they built in their basement, right? So for many, many years, I've had this conversation with people who I've respected in the past in their party, but for many years, the Republican leadership invited in at the margins, at the periphery, where they thought they could control them, some of the worst elements in society. They've invited in people who have been affiliated with violent paramilitary organizations. They've invited in those who have more than dabbled in extreme white supremacy. They've invited in those who have used the rhetoric of violence in politics in dangerous ways and in hateful ways. But there was always this sense that they could control the Frankenstein in their basement. The Frankenstein got out of the basement. The Frankenstein became their candidate. And there's a way that their primary base has completely been altered, misshapen in a way that seems beholden to a cult of personality more than any set of values and policies. Right now, it feels as if inside the Republican Party, if Donald Trump says that the sun revolves around the earth and not the other way around, then all of a sudden 80% of that electorate will believe that the sun revolves around the earth. It is a fact-free space that has been made worse in the era of social media and at a time when the beast of hatred, of bigotry has been fed and has become really, really, really large.
We're running out of time.
No, we can't run out of time, man. Can't run out of time.
I'm uncertain what to focus on because there's so many things more that I want to talk about.
Sorry, I'll try to be briefer in my response.
No. You've been very brief. It's just been fascinating and very informative from where you sit in America to hear your perspective on things. So I'm going to stay with domestic issues. What do you think happens if Trump wins? If Trump wins, how do you think Democrats, the Democratic Party and Democratic associated people or the population responds? It's one. The second is, are you worried about democracy in America? How do you see?
So first, I'll answer from a place of my own personal optimism. I'm with many others are doing everything that we can to preserve, protect, and promote a set of values that I believe will strengthen democracy. And those values are, of course, going to be attached to a set of policy outcomes that we think are absolutely essential and that indicate that we are listening to our populations, learning and growing with them. I also, if I put on my partisan hat, I have to say I've known Vice President Kamala Harris for some time. I'm always just enormously impressed with her, inspired by her. I think that she has, in the short time that she's had, I think that she's been an impressive candidate. I think her campaign is extraordinarily well run. And they have created the best chance possible for Democrats to win. And I think that she's going to prevail. I will add, Ann, that even if she wins, there's cause for concern because she'll win in a tight election. And Donald Trump has already demonstrated his inability to concede defeat. And he will exhort his followers to contest the results. And contest them in a way that is anti-democratic and could be violent in many states. I hope and expect the federal government, state governments, local governments to take quick preemptive action to calm the waters post-election so we don't have a repeat of 2020. Now, what happens in the Democratic Party if Donald Trump is successful? I think that you're going to um, see the Democratic Party go through a couple of things. One, there's going to be a mode of instant resistance that we see that sparked across communities. Abortion rights, huge issue in this campaign. I think the fear of the federalization of the restrictions on women's rights to choose that we're seeing in multiple states, that fear will be a real one if Donald Trump should win. And you'll see a mobilization by institutional Democrats and by rank and file folk against those kinds of actions. I think that, there'll be, I think Democrats are going to control the House of Representatives. I think that's the likely outcome of this election, and that'll be a bulwark of that resistance. You'll see a fight that begins instantly around the restoration or rollback of the Trump tax cuts. You'll see Republicans emboldened in the U.S. Senate who will be looking to shut down government services in a budget negotiation. So that will be another moment where the entire world will look to the U.S. and will wonder if we have the ability to continue to be, the standard currency in the world and all those important things. I think that you will see from Trump a determination to move away from long-held commitments that we have overseas, NATO being one, of course, the commitment to Ukraine and pushing back against the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, who seems to be on a first-name chummy basis with Donald Trump. So you'll see all of those things, I think, being contested, being litigated by the Democratic Party to stop the worst offenses from happening. And you'll also see a protection of whistleblowers inside of that government as Donald Trump and his Project 2025 cohort begin to take a series of steps that would crumble checks and balances inside of the government. So I could go on, but I won't, because you reminded me that we're short on time. I'm trying to.
I'm going to indulge everyone for one more question, which comes out of what you've just said. China is often said to be a country that likes certainty, that they like stability, economic and other reasons. What do you think? Who do you think they want to win?
I think China would be pleased with a much weaker United States. I think they'd be pleased with a much weaker NATO and EU. I think they'd be pleased with instability in our multilateral institutions. The election of Donald Trump represents that weakness, that chaos, that instability. And given what we saw in interference in the US election system from China in 2016 and 2020, and what we're already seeing online with activity that clearly is coming from China, it's pretty obvious that they have their thumb on the scale for Donald Trump this time around. It was clear that President Xi doesn't have a tremendous amount of respect for Donald Trump. The case with many other autocrats who believe that this is somebody who is easily flattered and manipulated in ways that weakens the U.S. And strengthens the global hand and reach of China, Russia, etc. I do think that the Chinese are still interested in finding ways to cooperate around climate and a number of other challenges that exist in the world. But they do see Donald Trump as an opportunity to extend their power and leverage.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our hour, and I need to stick to our commitment to everybody. I was going to ask you to recite some poetry, but
really?
Yeah. I read that you like poetry, and
I love poetry. You can ask me to do that. What poetry? What poet do you have in mind?
Well, I thought You could choose your favorite one.
My
The
my
Great
favorite
Russian.
my
Or,
favorite poet is Anna Bernstein, who was a Russian poet who was oppressed by her government, but made the decision to stay in and fight the good fight. So if I were going to recite something, it would be by Akhmatova, and her resistance to going into exile. She wrote, "I'm not one of those who left the country for wolves to tear it limb from limb. Their flattery does not touch me. I will not give my songs to them. Yet I can take the exile's part. I pity all among the dead. Wanderer, your path is dark. Wormwood is the stranger's bread. And we know there will be a reckoning and account for every hour. There's nobody simpler than us with more pride or fewer tears." So I'll recite that for my family that did go into exile, that was forced into exile, and for those who were standing and fighting for their country. I gave you the short version and left off a stanza, and only because you're out of time.
well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us this time. It's been fantastic and really fascinating. I hope you have a good election next week, and that, yeah, that America prospers. So
Thank you, Ann. Next time I'm on, we're going to talk about South Africa.
good, good. We'll make a date for that. Thank
Deal.
you. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We will be producing a edited summary of this and distributing it, but this conversation is over. Thank you for joining us. Patrick, thank you very much indeed. Good night.
Thank you. See you soon.
Great. Bye.